Welcome to Starbound, where every star tells a story. Have you ever pondered what it takes to transform a disciplined alien warrior into a primal survivor on Earth? Let's get into the story. Kieran, a Dragnon centurion, prided himself on discipline. His plating, gunmetal gray, gleamed with the meticulous care demanded by a strict military tradition. Every drill, every regulation had been ingrained in him since his hatching. Now, on this strange blue-green world called Earth, he found himself questioning it all. The Conclave had sent him, their finest, to this system at the edge of civilized space. The humans, it was explained, possessed certain advantages. Their world was a crucible of extremes, forging them into warriors unlike any the galaxy had seen. Kieran found this explanation both insulting and intriguing. They were deposited in a vast expanse of water, an ocean, the humans called it. The transport vanished back into the sky, leaving his cohort of the Conclave's best clinging to flimsy rafts in the crushing darkness. "Instructor Jackson will be your guide," a disembodied translated voice had declared. "Welcome to Earth." And then came the silence. Kieran clung to his weapon, a standard-issue plasma caster, feeling more vulnerable than ever before. The darkness was absolute, the water an unseen beast tugging at their pathetic craft. He could hear the panicked rasp of a Valky, the low growl of an Ursani, cutting through the relentless slap of waves. This was no battlefield, this was chaos. A shape erupted from the black depths, barely visible against the gloom. It towered over them, a mass of mottled flesh and too many eyes. A human head, grotesquely enlarged, floated above it. "Welcome to the Marianas Trench, gentlemen," a rough voice boomed, crackling over a primitive comm system. "We're gonna get to know each other very well." Kieran hissed in defiance, his warrior instincts surging, yet something in the creature's voice and the casual disregard of their surroundings made him hesitate. This human wasn't afraid. In fact, there was a hint of dark amusement in his tone. "Objective 1, the human continued. "Survive." Instructor Jackson, as it turned out, was a master of understatement. Survive meant enduring pressure that threatened to crush a Dragnon's carapace. It meant navigating near blind through bioluminescent terrors, relying on the human's cryptic directions. Worst of all, it meant enduring the constant, biting commentary. "You call that a defensive formation?" Jackson mocked as Kieran and his hastily assembled squad huddled against an ambush of monstrous fanged fish. "My grandmother could outmaneuver you, and she's been dead for a decade." Insults, Kieran learned quickly, were a key component of human warfare. At first, they ignited his Dragnon temper, yet with no time to argue, their only choices were to adapt or fail. Slowly, painfully, Kieran began to ignore his ingrained protocols. He mimicked the human's erratic movements, rolling and dodging instead of meeting threats head-on like a proper soldier. The Valky fared little better. Their honed aerial combat skills were useless in the ocean depths. Jackson forced them to improvise, turning their wings into battering rams and slashing weapons. The Ursani, however, surprised him. Their immense strength could be an asset if they could be controlled. "Think before you charge," Jackson roared at a young Ursani who blindly rushed a lurking predator twice its size. "You're a weapon, not a battering ram." The days dissolved into a nightmarish blur of freezing depths, then blistering sun as Jackson herded them to the surface and onto the shore. No sooner had the salt dried on their scales and feathers than they were thrust into a blinding expanse of white. "Antarctica!" Jackson grinned, a feral expression beneath his thick, frosted beard. "You haven't experienced cold until you've been here." Kieran had faced the frozen wastes of a dozen worlds. Yet Earth's icy breath was an entirely different beast. It gnawed through his armor, chilling his blood and making every movement an agonizing effort. This wasn't just about survival. This was about dominance over the elements themselves. Jackson, of course, thrived. He wore their sophisticated envirosuits with disdain, relying on crude layers of animal skins and a stubborn internal fire that seemed impervious to the cold. "You're overcomplicating it," he chided as Kieran fumbled with the settings on his thermal regulator. "Embrace the pain. Let it fuel you." The human led them not through the brutal emptiness, but into it. They built shelters from snow, not with advanced field generators, but with their own claws and blades. They hunted under the eerie glow of the aurora, learning to read ice and wind like a second language. Pain, Kieran realized, wasn't an obstacle. It was information. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A blizzard roared down on them, and Jackson ordered them to scatter and dig in. Kieran, alone, his vision reduced to near nothing, fought the panic. Then came a memory. The feel of sand whipping his skin in the searing desert moons of his homeworld. He flattened himself, mimicking not his rigid training, but the shifting patterns of the elements. When the storm subsided, he was still alive, and as Jackson's gruff praise reached him, something ignited within. Not defiance, but a grudging respect. This human, this maddening, relentless creature, knew things about survival no conclave drill master could teach. There was the Sahara next, and with it came a new form of torment. Days of relentless sun beatdown, turning their sleek suits into ovens. The Valkyries suffered terribly, their feathers becoming matted and brittle. Jackson pushed them on, his eyes like chips of ice. The desert felt endless, an eternity of thirst, shimmering heat, and sand. It was here, with his body a screaming protest, that Kieran finally broke. "Why?" He snarled at Jackson, sand rasping through his vocalizer. "What is the point of this torture?" The human squinted against the glare, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "The point, my armored friend," he drawled, "is that you can't break the desert. So it'll break you, or," he trailed off, gesturing towards a shimmering ridge, "you adapt." Jackson wasn't offering a choice. He was providing a painful truth. In that moment, Kieran's perfectly maintained discipline shattered. The Dragnan Centurion, product of generations of honed military tradition, was stripped down to raw survival instinct. He studied the shimmering mirage, not as a distant illusion, but as a potential key. His eyes adjusted, not to the vast emptiness, but to the subtle shifts in the sand, the flicker of heat indicating hidden moisture. His rigid march transformed into a flowing glide, minimizing his contact with the scorching grains. The desert was an enemy, yes, but with a language of its own. The Valkyries, surprisingly, were the first to adapt. They shed their scorched plumage to expose cooler skin beneath, finding an unexpected resilience in the act. Jackson taught them to read the thermals, soaring on hot air currents to conserve energy. He made the Ursani gather coarse desert grasses, weaving them into rough garments that insulated them against the extremes. They emerged from the crucible scorched, exhausted, but undeniably changed. There was a brutal efficiency to their movements now, a shedding of unnecessary formality. On the final trek out, Kieran caught his reflection in a rare oasis. He looked like a warrior, but not one from any battlefield he knew. This planet and this human had forged something new, something dangerous. News reached them abruptly. They weren't given time to fully comprehend the weight of it. That was the human way. Jackson gathered them, his face grim for the first time since they had arrived on this cursed planet. "The enemy," he growled. "They've arrived, and they're exactly as nasty as the Conclave feared." Images flashed across a primitive screen, cities reduced to rubble, not by orbital bombardment, but by monstrous creatures ripping through them with an unholy hunger. Their forms defied easy description, all teeth and tentacles and gleaming eyes. The Conclave's finest had already fallen, their tactics laughably ineffective against this ravenous swarm. Kieran felt something akin to fear, yet it was different from the gnawing anxiety of his early days on Earth. This was a cold, focused dread. He looked around at his battered squad. The Ursani's eyes blazed with a fury that mirrored his own. The Valky, their feathers starting to grow back, held their heads high with a newfound feral tenacity. They weren't just warriors anymore. Earth had made them into something far more primal. "Lesson 1, Jackson said, his rough voice echoing in the silence. "Know your enemy." He flicked through images of the monstrous creatures. They're mindless, instinctual, but even animals have patterns. The training that followed was a brutal blur. No longer merely struggling to survive, they were honed into living weapons. Jackson pushed them past exhaustion, teaching them to fight blind, injured, to anticipate the movements of a foe that defied all logic. When the Valky complained their wings were too damaged for flight, Jackson forced them to turn the tattered remnants into whips, into slashing, distracting weapons. The Ursani learned controlled recklessness, how to turn their rage into a battering ram. And Kieran learned to embrace the chaos. The human taught him to fight dirty, to exploit any weakness. He became one with the shadows, striking from unexpected angles. His once predictable Dragnan tactics twisted into something cunning and vicious. Earth, Jackson taught him, was a weapon, so use it. They were called to battle. It was now that Jackson's methods and human brutality was on display. Whilst humans were made to set out this fight, this new elite squadron could show what they were capable of. The battlefield wasn't what they expected. It was a sprawling Valky city, half crumbled and eerily silent. An unnatural twilight descended as the vast, insect-like form of an enemy mothership blotted out the sun. The Conclave forces were regrouping in shattered bunkers. Their elegant uniforms were torn, their weapons scored by acid and claws. Kieran heard a whimper that might have come from a Valky elite, once renowned for their stoic grace. Jackson was a hurricane of motion, shouting orders into a battered comm unit. "Listen up," he barked, fixing his icy gaze on Kieran and the squad. "You're prototypes, untested, potentially insane, but the best hope we've got." He paused, a predatory grin twisting his scarred features. "So let's show these bastards what Earth-made means." He shoved a bulky pack into Kieran's arms. "Crude, but effective," he explained, nodding at the archaic explosive device within. "Plant it, and you cripple the command structure. If we're lucky, it'll cause enough chaos for the fleet to break formation." The plan was insane. It was gloriously, savagely human. Kieran felt a savage thrill, an echo of Jackson's own cold fire. They weren't meant to win, just disrupt. Sow enough mayhem to buy the Conclave time. His scales prickled in anticipation. These nightmares had made him a hunter. They moved as humans did, not in formation but as a whirlwind of unpredictable violence. The Valky darted between ruined buildings, their damaged wings flashing like blades. An Ursani roaring a challenge no sane being would answer, became a decoy, drawing a hulking beast into a crossfire. Kieran, a specter in the rubble, slipped past the notice of the monstrous guards, his heart a cold drumbeat against his ribs. The hive was pulsing viscera and glistening mucus. The stench of decay made his stomach churn. Yet as he placed the explosive, he felt a chilling clarity. This wasn't about bravery. This was about necessity. This was about becoming whatever it took to survive. The detonation rocked the hive. Acid blood sprayed, showering Kieran in a burning rain. He dodged and weaved through the ensuing chaos, deafened by monstrous screeches and the thunder of collapsing tunnels. Above, the tide seemed to shift. Starships flickered into view, the Conclave regrouping thanks to the suicidal distraction he and his cohort had provided. But the battle was far from over. Wounded and outnumbered, they had to escape. Jackson was everywhere, a blur of tattered clothing and flashing blade. He hauled a downed Ursani to safety, a severed tentacle clutched in his other hand. "Never waste ammo!" he bellowed as he flung the appendage at a pursuing creature, the acid buying them precious seconds. The Valky, their feathers ragged but their spirit unbroken, were doing what they were born to do. They soared, distracting the winged monstrosities plaguing the Conclave fleet. Kieran, seeing his chance, dashed for a human transport vessel, its engines whining as it struggled to lift off. Jackson was caught mid-lunge, a creature closing in when Kieran disobeyed every instinct and spun back. His caster flared, not with the clean plasma of Dragnan warfare, but a ragged pulse learned battling the monstrous fish of the ocean depths. The creature shrieked in agony, smoke billowing from its chest. Jackson's eyes widened, then a savage grin cracked his face. They scrambled aboard the transport as the Valky, in a final desperate act, dive-bombed a cluster of the enemy, sacrificing themselves to buy the survivors' escape. As the starscape blurred past, Kieran collapsed, his body screaming in protest. Jackson landed beside him, a heavy hand clapping his shoulder. "Not bad," the human rasped, blood staining his teeth. "Not bad at all." They returned to Earth, battered but unbowed. The planet that had forged them was now grudgingly their sanctuary. The Conclave forces were regrouping. The monstrous enemy had been stalled, but more were coming. The human high command looked at Kieran and his surviving squad with a mixture of horror and fascination. These were not the same soldiers they had sent into the Crucible. They were leaner, harder, their eyes haunted with the cold fire of survivors. "We need more," a Conclave admiral stated, his usual impeccable uniform disheveled. "More like this." He turned to Jackson. "Can you train them? All of them?" The human considered, then shrugged. We can try, but they won't all survive, and those that do," he grinned, his teeth flashing white in his grime-streaked face, "they'll never be quite the same." The second training cycle began, larger and even more brutal. Earth became a boot camp, its harsh environments honed into weapons against an unthinkable foe. Word of the strange success among the humans even reached the highest levels of Conclave governance. A delegation descended, not with their previous arrogance, but with desperate, unspoken pleas in their eyes. Kieran was never the same. His scales bore the scars of the desert. His caster was permanently warped from the depths. Inside him, the rigid discipline of the Dragnon battled the untamed ferocity the humans had unleashed. He had been remade. The war, when it came in its full, terrible glory, was a brutal, bloody slog through the stars. Kieran led from the front, his soldiers now a brotherhood forged in fire. The enemy was monstrous, the Conclave refined but ill-prepared. But there was Earth's steel in them now, an echo of Jackson's relentless drive. They won by inches, by seconds, fueled by desperation and the grim knowledge that even if they did drive back the swarm, their fight would never truly end. Earth, ironically, remained untouched after that first battle. It was seen as too dangerous, too unpredictable, the humans too valuable as teachers, not frontline fighters. Yet the whispers in the Conclave chambers changed. Humans weren't barbarians, they were something far more terrifying. Survivors. Decades passed in a blur of skirmishes and brutal campaigns. Kieran rose through the ranks, becoming a legend in his own right. Humans, still deemed too chaotic for full membership, were given a strange new role. Advisors, they were called, attached to elite Conclave squads, offering their unconventional insights. Jackson remained on Earth. The years had weathered him further, carving lines across his face like the cracked earth of the desert moons. He trained new recruits, each cycle tougher than the last, the planet itself his most merciless instructor. One cycle brought a young Dragnon under his tutelage. The warrior was proud, rigid, so familiar it made Kieran's scales prickle with remembrance. On the first night in the crushing depths of the ocean, Kieran found himself waiting out, heedless of the protocol that forbade his interference. The human was there, of course, watching with those piercing eyes. "Help him or leave him," Jackson stated, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "But don't do it halfway, Centurion." Kieran waded into the darkness. He remembered his own breaking point, the feeling of being crushed beneath a universe he didn't understand. He offered no words of comfort, no easy reassurances. Instead, he swam deeper, matching the young recruit's fumbling strokes, showing him how to read the currents, how to find the slivers of light even in the abyss. When they reached the surface, the young warrior was gasping, his eyes wide. He stared at Kieran, seeing not a superior officer, but something less definable. "That is how they made you," he whispered in awe. Kieran didn't reply, simply met Jackson's gaze. The old human gave a curt nod. It was approval, Earth style. Later, alone in the eerie half-light of his quarters, Kieran looked at the rough scar tissue where his plating had been torn in the desert. It wasn't a mark of shame, but a mark of a battle fought and won. Earth, that cursed, beautiful planet had broken him, yes, but it had also forged him into something capable of facing the galaxy's worst. It gave him purpose when the strict order of his old life might have crumbled in the face of the relentless enemy. Humans weren't just allies, they were a dark, necessary mirror, showing the Conclave what it took to not just fight, but endure. The war, as all wars do, eventually reached a turning point. It wasn't a glorious battle, but 1,000 small, desperate stands. The endless swarm was finally being outmaneuvered, their mindless hunger countered by the brutal, adaptive tactics born on Earth. Even the humans were grudgingly given their due, their presence on the front lines a testament to their terrifying effectiveness. Yet the cost was staggering. Squads Kieran had trained himself were decimated. The Valky, their elegant sacrifice for lethal efficiency, were a shadow of their former numbers. The Ursani, once boisterous and larger than life, moved with a grim, haunting stoicism. Jackson called him back to Earth. It seemed wrong to rest when others fight, but the human's scarred face was unreadable. Earth, once the crucible, was now a haven. Fleets of wounded filled the orbit, the land dotted with sprawling medical centers and rehabilitation facilities. Survivors drifted through the human settlements, aliens broken in ways no doctor could truly heal. "It's not about winning anymore," Jackson grunted, staring out at the vast ocean that had been their first battlefield. "It's about making sure there's something left to fight for." Kieran didn't need explanations. He saw it in the way a human medic tirelessly tended to a wounded Ursani with a gentleness that defied her rough exterior. He saw it in the makeshift school erected beside the ruins of a human library, where Valky navigated the complexities of language with a scarred Dragnan warrior. He saw it in the relentless determination with which they rebuilt, every scar a testament to battles won and ones still to come. The Conclave sent their best engineers, their strategists, but it was the humans who became the heart of this new endeavor. Their adaptability, honed over millennia of global turmoil, was now focused on healing, not just hurting. Earth's legacy wasn't merely hardened warriors, it was resilience. Kieran, warrior turned statesman in the crucible of war, finally understood. The Conclave hadn't seen humans as equals because they were brutal, but because they were survivors. They clawed their way through chaos, not because they reveled in it, but because the alternative was extinction. It was a lesson worth more than any tactical superiority. The galaxy won the war. It might never fully win the peace, but on Earth, something new was being built, a testament, not just to a species, but to an unwavering spirit forged in fire. The war dragged into a tense armistice. No one dared call it peace. The swarm had retreated, licking its wounds, and every world rebuilt while holding their breath, waiting for the next monstrous wave to descend. Kieran found his place, surprisingly, in the diplomatic corps. The Dragnan scales that were once his armor were now marks of a battle-hardened negotiator. He sat at tables with Conclave elite, the old disdain replaced with a tenuous respect. Beside him, a human advisor, chosen from the hardened survivors of Jackson's first brutal training cycles. They offered insights honed by 100 desperate battles. Their voices held undeniable weight now. Jackson didn't join them. The old warrior remained on Earth, the planet now a haven for the broken, scarred remnants of 100 species. There were training facilities for new recruits, yes, but also fields filled with strange, mismatched crops, attempts to feed a ravaged galaxy. There were clinics where Valky healers, trained in the brutal efficiency of battlefield triage, now delved into the complexities of trauma and loss. When Kieran returned on rare, exhausted leaves, Jackson would simply nod, that same grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Still alive, then?" He'd rasp, offering Kieran not sympathy but the unspoken acknowledgement of shared horrors. At first, Kieran missed the action, the quiet nod at the restlessness Earth had instilled in him. But then, in the laughter of a newly hatched Dragnan kid, the fierce protectiveness in the eyes of a Valky mother, or the stoic determination etched on the face of an Ursani amputee, he found his new purpose. Humanity, he finally understood, wasn't about chaos or raw brutality. It was about an unyielding will to keep going, to rebuild, to find hope even in the ashes. The war had changed the galaxy, but it was the quiet strength of Earth, its unwavering determination to snatch a future from the jaws of extinction, that truly left its mark. He was their weapon, yes, but perhaps it was time for him to become their shield. Kieran, the warrior reforged, was weary. Yet in the echoes of lessons learned on a distant blue-green world, he found the strength to not just fight, but to shape the peace that must come after. Earth was his crucible, the humans his relentless instructors, and he, along with 1,000 others tempered by their harsh wisdom, would ensure their sacrifice wasn't in vain.